Death with dignity, also known as assisted suicide, is a right all terminally ill Americans should have, yet currently only 7 states and the District of Columbia have statutes supporting it. Death with dignity is an end-of-life option that allows terminally ill adults to legally request and procure a prescription from their doctor to end their life. A 2017 Gallup poll found that 73% of U.S. adults support physician-assisted death in the case of terminally ill patients who request assistance with ending their lives. People who are terminally ill, who are of sound mind, should be able to decide how they would like to die, just as they have had the freedom to decide how they have lived, regardless of what state they reside in. But there are many people who disagree, who fear passing death with dignity legislation. Frequently, toward the end of a battle with cancer, a patient is in severe pain, the worst of which could be avoided if patients lived in states with death with dignity legislation. Those who are opposed to Death with Dignity Acts suggest that palliative care should be enough. Palliative care focuses on relieving pain and discomfort, and while it is an option, it has its limits. In his May 17, 2013 CQ Researcher article, Assisted Suicide, Should Doctors Be Allowed to Help Terminally Ill Patients Die?, Reed Carame notes that in the most extreme cases, opponents suggest palliative sedation, where a patient is drugged into a comatose state to escape pain, eventually wasting away and dying of starvation. Brittany Maynard, a 29-year-old Californian with terminal brain cancer, didn't want to die that way. Barbara Coombs Lee and David Groom detail the process she went through in 2014 in their article, Medical Aid in Dying, the Cornerstone of Patient-Centered Care, in the Journal of the American Society of Aging in the spring of 2017, when after surgery, after exhausting all possible treatment options with her tumor growing and causing crippling headaches and seizures, Brittany moved to Oregon to take advantage of their Death with Dignity Act. She died peacefully in her sleep with her family beside her. Brittany died on her own terms, peacefully, avoiding what was sure to be a much more painful death. Rebecca Benight's death, however, wasn't the peaceful death it should have been had her physician been able to assist her. Jonas Fortune of Lancaster Online writes in his article, Manor Township Man Pleads Guilty to Aiding His Wife's January Suicide, that after suffering multiple strokes and throat cancer, she was ready to die. Her husband, Philip, checked her out of her care home, crushing a large quantity of oxycodone, Percocet, and Valium, mixed it into Rebecca's pudding, and fed it to her. Fortune goes on to write that he also attempted to take his own life. Both were found unconscious the next day and were revived. Rebecca died 8 days later, and Philip survived. A memoir entry of his was found that read, "The only reason I have to go with her is because I'm not willing to live in prison for murder." There is no question that prison is what he would have deserved had Rebecca not wanted to die, or had there been any question about the decision at all. But Rebecca did want to die. In fact, she'd talked about it with her husband and friends on multiple occasions. Wesley Robinson of the Pennsylvania Real-Time News writes in his November 14, 2017 article, Husband Gets House Arrest for Aiding Wife's Suicide by Putting Pills in Her Pudding, that in the end, Philip Benight was sentenced to 6 to 23 months of house arrest, probation, and court fines. And while that's better than a prison sentence, the last thing that should have been on his mind is legal trouble. His case exemplifies why death with dignity legislation should be made available no matter what state a person resides in. Many opponents fear that once death with dignity measures are passed, it's just a matter of time before assisted suicide is used for those we'd rather not deal with at all. As Rosie DiMano in her article, Euthanasia is Barbarous and Immoral, wrote, do not for 1 minute pretend that this is anything other than a slippery slope towards the annihilation of human beings who tax our willingness to cope with the disabled, the deformed, the grievously ill. But as Reed Carame noted in his May 17, 2013 CQ Researcher article, Assisted Suicide, Should Doctors Be Allowed to Help Terminally Ill Patients Die?, a study led by Margaret Batten, professor of internal medicine in the Division of Medical Ethics at the University of Utah, found no evidence that physician-assisted suicide has had a disproportionate impact on patients in vulnerable groups, including the physically disabled, the poor, individuals with low educational status, or racial minorities. Without a doubt, death with dignity legislation absolutely needs to be written very carefully. According to the Death with Dignity National Center, there are now 7 states, as well as the District of Columbia, that have passed such measures. Oregon was the first to pass death with dignity legislation in 1997, and California, Colorado, Montana, Vermont, and Washington all passed legislation since that time. Hawaii has just passed a bill that will go into effect in January 2019. We can and should look to these bills for guidance when writing bills for states that are seeking to pass this type of legislation. The Death with Dignity National Center notes that as a result of well-written legislation, when a terminally ill patient is considering ending their own life in a state with the Death with Dignity Act, there are a number of steps they need to take. First and foremost, the individual must meet eligibility requirements. They must be a resident of the area or district. They must be 18 years of age or older. They must be mentally competent, and they must be diagnosed with a terminal illness that will, within reasonable medical judgment, lead to death within 6 months. The patient needs to talk to their doctor and their family. The doctor needs to know the patient's wishes and reasoning, and the family should know these things as well. There is a waiting period after the oral request, and the patient must make a second oral request along with a written request. Then there is a second waiting period in some states. After that, the doctor may write the prescription. This is not an easy prescription to get, and it shouldn't be. End-of-life decisions like these have to be the hardest decisions terminally ill people must face. I strongly believe people deserve a gentle, peaceful death if that's what they choose, that their doctors should be able to write them a prescription to help them with that process, and that their loved ones should be with them if that is what they choose. I believe in the freedom to choose in the way we live and the freedom to choose in the way we die.